Turn to James chapter 1. James chapter 1. In James chapter 1, beginning in verse 13, let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one. But each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. Then desire, when it has conceived, gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death. I hope that we all understand this morning that none of us are immune. None of us lives without the weakness of the flesh. There's not a single one of us that is above sin. All of us have the capability to fall prey to temptation. In 1 John chapter 1 and verse 8, it says, if we say that we have no sin, we are deceiving ourselves, and the truth is not in us. In Romans chapter 3 and verse 23, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. So as long as we pretend like we're somehow above it and that we're not prone to fall for it, then we're going to continue to place ourselves in situations where it is almost impossible to resist it. Sin is the problem, and sin is the biggest problem that all of us have. And so given the right set of circumstances, all of us are capable of giving in. And Satan knows that very well. He knows it very well. So that's why it is absolutely essential that you and I do everything that we can to make temptation terribly inconvenient. Because if we make temptation inconvenient, then it will be easier for us to resist it and to escape it. You can resist it and you can escape from it, but again, it's not going to happen by accident. So let me share with you some thoughts for your consideration this morning when it comes to temptation. First of all, I want to point out that you need to know your limits. Know your limits. When you and I do battle with temptation on a regular basis, there's not anything that is more deadly to any of us than to take the approach of being overconfident. Proverbs chapter 16 verse 18 says, pride goes before a fall. That is overconfidence. And no one is more overconfident than the person that I'll simply call the risk taker. He's the one that Paul is describing in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 12 when he says, therefore let him who thinks he stands take heed that he does not fall. The risk taker is the person who is addicted to moral danger, to ethical excitement. He, I guess, would be the equivalent to the spiritual, those of you who remember Evel Knievel. He's the kind of person who likes to walk on the edge. He realizes the possibility of sinful failure in everybody else, but his motto is, it will never happen to me. I've heard people say that. I will never fall away. They fall away. It will never happen to me. So there are two truths in all of this. The risk taker almost always overestimates his moral resolve. And secondly, he underestimates the power of Satan. You see, you issue Satan a challenge. Issue him a challenge and he'll take you up on it 100% of the time. He will. He'll be happy to. Now, by way of illustration, think about the Old Testament character by the name of Samson. Samson was your classic risk taker. Here was a man raised by godly parents. Here's a man dedicated to the Lord from the day of his birth. Judges chapter 13 and verse 25 said the Spirit of the Lord came upon him. But while Samson was a man used by God, he was hardly a man of God, because he became a risk taker. Samson liked to walk on the edge. He liked to see how close he could get to fire without getting burned. But many of you know the story. He did get burned. He got burned bad. The fact is that risk takers, again, people who like to live life and walk on the edge, they always get burned eventually. They do. You know, for years I thought Samson had to be one of the dumbest guys who ever lived. I did. How else could you possibly explain this warped relationship he had with this Philistine, Delilah? Every time Samson gives her false information regarding the source of his strength, she turns around and tells the Philistines, and they seek to come in on him, and this happened over and over and over and over again. Even the most dim-witted man would have to figure out that, okay, there's something not right here. There's just something. Every time I tell her, here they come. And yet he still bared his heart to her over and over and over. Why? Why did Samson do that? Well, again, he was very intelligent. It wasn't that he wasn't smart. He knew exactly what he was doing. So the question becomes, why did he do that? Why did Samson share with her the secret source of his strength? Well, I'll tell you why. Because I think he enjoyed the risk. He enjoyed the risk. Now, you can argue that Delilah was using Samson, and that's true. But do you not understand that he was using her just as much as she was using him? Because flirting with danger gave a person like Samson a rush, that we might say. It gave him a rush. You see, Delilah was not Samson's undoing. Samson's undoing was himself. His undoing was his overconfidence that he can never fall. But you know the rest of the story. That's why I say all of us have to live within our limits. The person who gets very serious about overcoming temptation does not put himself or herself in situations where you know that you're going to be tempted. He or she doesn't go about flirting with danger. If you want to rush, if you want some excitement, then go bungee jumping. Go jump out of a plane. Do something like that if you want to rush. I'll tell you, that will give you a rush. But if you want to get burned, if you want to mess up your life with consequences that you will have for the rest of your life, then start doing what Samson did. Start flirting with Satan, and it's going to happen. You've got to know your limits. And when you know your limits, we minimize our risk of giving into temptation because we don't place ourselves in situations where we know that we're going to have trouble. We just don't go there. Joseph got it. Joseph understood 1 Corinthians chapter 6 and verse 18 to flee immorality. And Joseph understood that sometimes you have to do just that. Sometimes you just have to run away from it. Every one of us have certain things that are very tempting to us, and each one of us know exactly what they are. And Satan knows exactly what they are. And so what we must do, we have to acknowledge our weakness. That's very hard to do, but we have to acknowledge our weakness. We have to confess our vulnerability before God. But third, we have to develop a strategy that will enable us to overcome by not putting ourselves in that position. There are certain places that you need to avoid. There are certain people that you need to avoid. If you're going to win over temptation, the only way to do it is to deal with Satan from a position of strength, not weakness. Paul said in Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 15, "Therefore be careful how you walk, not as unwise men, but as wise." But then secondly, you need to listen to the early warning signs. Listen to the early warning signs. I did some thinking about this, and I grew up in Indiana, and as you know, right now there's I don't know if it's become a hurricane yet or not, but it's heading into the Gulf, and it possibly could be here Wednesday or Thursday, and so we have advance notice of this hurricane that's coming. But I grew up in Indiana, and we didn't have to worry about hurricanes. We had tornadoes. And it would be, sunny day, and the afternoon would come, and the clouds would get dark, and a tornado would just come right out of the sky. And so we would become very tornado conscious, and for good reason. So when you become aware of things like tornadoes, you start to watch the sky when storm clouds show up. And we would understand the terms very clearly. We understood that when the National Weather Service issued a tornado watch, we understood what that means as conditions are favorable for the formation of a tornado. And we're familiar with that because usually after hurricanes, tornadoes start to pop up and we hear there's a tornado watch in Polk County or tornado warning in Polk County. We also understand that when the National Weather Service issues a tornado warning, that means we need to take shelter because one's been spotted. Meteorologists tells us that tornadoes form only when atmospheric conditions are just right. Things have to be just right for that to happen. And I want you to think about this. Isn't it the same with temptation? Isn't it the same thing? There are certain times when circumstances in your life place you in a situation where you become very vulnerable. The atmospheric conditions of your life warrant a temptation watch, if you will. When you start associating with people whose values are not God's. When you begin to pull away from your support system, from brothers and sisters in Christ, and you start skipping the assembly. When you go through a time of major loss, maybe there's a death, maybe there's divorce, maybe there's job loss, or there's physical crisis or emotional crisis, or whatever it may be, all of a sudden the atmospheric conditions begin to occur, and your vulnerability of spiritual weakness increases. And you are under a temptation watch because the conditions are favorable for a fall. Peter is a great example. At the arrest of Jesus, he becomes very spiritually delusioned. And then the others fled, and here's Peter, and he's lost his support system. Everybody's gone. He's physically exhausted. He's emotionally exhausted. And now he finds himself warming his hands by the fire, surrounded by the very enemies of Jesus. Again, you talk about atmospheric conditions. Peter should have been able to read the warning signs, but he didn't. Nobody needs to be caught unaware when temptation strikes. Look at 1 Corinthians chapter 10, if you will. 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 13. 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 13. No temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man. God is faithful, and he will not let you be tempted beyond your ability. But with the temptation, he will also provide the way of escape, that you may be able to endure it. One of the ways that we escape is when we begin to read the warning signs. A tornado just does not drop out of a clear blue sky. It doesn't. Before there is a tornado, we know how the dark clouds start to appear. Something within you tells you that something just isn't right. You start to feel uneasy. You begin to sense it. Sometimes you can't even put your finger on it. But you know there's going to be trouble. You just know it. When it comes to temptation, it's the same thing. It is the same thing. Do you not understand that God has given each of us early warning detection centers within us? It's called our conscience. He's given all of us a conscience. Now, we have a human tendency sometimes to rationalize our conscience, to reason away our conscience, and we say to ourselves, well, I must be overreacting. It can't be that big of a deal. Or Samson-like, I'm spiritually strong. I can handle this. And so we ignore the temptation warning that our conscience is going off. The alarm's going off. I like the story of a little boy who asked his mother, "What is a conscience?" And she replied and said, "Honey, a conscience is that little voice inside of you that warns you when you're about to do something bad and get into trouble." That night, the little boy knelt at his bedside to pray, and he prayed these words: "Dear God, please make my little voice get louder." You know, that ought to be our prayer. Out of the mouth of a child. That ought to be our prayer. Make my little voice get louder. How many of us could be saved from devastation spiritually if we would just heed the warning signs? But listening to our conscience is not enough. You've got to seek shelter. You got to seek shelter. Only a fool would dig a storm cellar when he sees a tornado approaching. But that's what we do with temptation. We wait until we're right smack dab in the middle of it, and then we try to figure out what we're going to do. And by that time, it's too late. It's too late. The time to set our moral standards, the time to draw our line in the sand is now. It's in advance. The time to decide what we're going to do about sexual promiscuity is before there's a situation where we are tempted with that. The same thing is true about drawing a line when it comes to alcohol and drugs. It's before we find ourselves in a position where we are weak. The time to decide what kind of clothes we're going to wear, or who our friends are going to be, is in advance. Not when we find ourselves with the wrong crowd to say, you know what, this probably isn't a good idea. You see, our conscience sounds a temptation watch. We know when we're going in the wrong direction. We know it. We sense it. We understand when we're headed that way. And our conscience is telling us, you need to wait a minute. You better start watching. And then suddenly, if we're not careful and if we don't respond accordingly and take steps to get out of that vulnerability, that's when our conscience starts sounding the warning signs. The warning alarm is going off. And then we know we're in trouble. And then finally, as I mentioned, we need to seek shelter. On May 28th, 1997, shoppers at an Albertson food store in Austin, Texas, stood at the doors and watched in hypnotic fascination as a huge tornado approached. Suddenly, a voice across the store intercom came on and said, "Do not leave this store, or you will die. You cannot outrun it. Your only chance of survival is to do exactly what I tell you to do right now." The voice was a man by the name of Larry Ford. He had lived in Wichita Falls when in 1979 a huge tornado ripped through the town, killing over 50 people and putting over 2,000 people in the hospital. It was his voice urging his customers and staff to seek shelter immediately. And he told people to run to the back of the store and to get into the steel reinforced meat locker. And that's what everybody did. They listened, and they went back and they locked themselves in that meat locker. And in a matter of seconds, after the door was shut, the store exploded as it took a direct hit from that tornado. Not a single life was lost, thanks to the quick thinking of a store manager who understood the danger. Do you understand that when a tornado, a spiritual twister, sweeps down upon your life, that each one of us has someone greater than this man, Larry Ford? Someone who's been there, done that, who's seen it coming? His name's Jesus. And he knows exactly what we need to do because he's seen the storm before. And he has survived the greatest temptations known to man. He has conquered everything that Satan threw at him. He conquered. And he lives to help us. In Hebrews chapter 4, verses 15 and 16, "For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. Let us then with confidence draw near to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need. He's been there and he knows what the storm looks like. He knows. And he knows how we can survive. That's why the psalmist says over and over again, the Lord is our refuge. He is our shelter in a time of storm. I leave you with 3 thoughts this morning, if you're going to survive. 3 simple thoughts. First of all, you need to put the word in your heart. In Psalm 119 and verse 11, your word I have treasured in my heart that I may not sin against you. The word has got to become important to us. It has to. It has to become our daily spiritual manna. That's exactly what Jesus did, is he used the word. He was in the word. It is written, he said 3 times, put the word in your heart, because it is that to which we turn when we see the storm approaching. Secondly, pray without ceasing. That right there is our storm shelter. Jesus said to go into your inner room and shut the door and pray. We do that physically when we see the storm approach, don't we? We go into the inner room and we close the door. Jesus said that there's always going to be storms. There's always going to be temptation. Always will. And he said to those men in Mark chapter 14, verse 38, keep watching and praying that you may not come into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. Pray without ceasing. When you see the storm coming, go into that inner room, close the door, and pray. And then finally, get with Christians. Get with Christians. Seek shelter with other people who can help you. Seek shelter with those who have been through the storms before. People who can help you survive. Don't pull away. Don't pull away. That is the worst thing any of us can ever do. And yet sometimes that is what we are tempted to do. We are tempted to pull away from our brothers and sisters in Christ. When we go through hard times, we pull away from people who can help us. Get with Christians. How do I overcome temptation? How do I overcome my limits? Or how do I know my limits? I need to listen to the early warning system that God has given me, called my conscience. And I need to seek shelter by putting the word in my heart, by praying without ceasing, and by getting with God's people and surrounding myself with others who care about me and who will do whatever they can to help protect and help get me through the storm, no matter what it is. And that's what we need to do for each other. All of us here this morning, as we look around, need to be there for each other, to protect each other when the storm comes. And so if you're here this morning and you've not yet rendered obedience to the gospel of Christ, we ask that you simply become a Christian. Become a part of God's family. Surround yourself with those who can help you. Again, we need to help each other get to heaven. We can't do it on our own. We need each other to get there. And maybe you are a Christian, and maybe you find yourself pulling yourself away. Come right back. Come right back to those who love you and who want to help you get to heaven. If you have a need, we ask that you